The Lenovo T730 is a pre-built gaming PC with some powerful hardware inside. In this review, we'll check out gaming performance, overclocking, thermals, and basically everything else to help you decide if it's a system you should consider buying. The Lenovo T730 is available with different hardware configurations. My unit has the 8-core Intel i9-9900K CPU, NVIDIA RTX 2080 graphics, 16GB of memory and dual channel, and for storage a 512GB NVMe M.2 SSD and 2TB hard drive. The motherboard also has Gigabit Ethernet, 802.11 AC Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth 4.1. You can find prices for varying configurations of the T730 linked in the description, and I'll cover upgrade options towards the end of the video. The case has a 28-litre volume and starts with a 12kg weight, but will of course vary based on specs. The dimensions of the case on the Lenovo website don't line up with what I'm seeing, so these are based on my own rough measurements. The black case is made of metal and plastic with an acrylic side panel, though the view is obscured by the metal mesh pattern behind it, which isn't that big of an issue as the interior is mostly plain metal. A similar mesh is found on the front, which should help with airflow. There's some Legion branding towards the top right on the front which lights up, and above this is the DVD drive, which is hidden behind a sliding door. On top of the case there's a handle, which I found very useful when taking it out of the box, but otherwise it would depend on how often you find yourself moving your PC as to how useful that would be. The front I/O is found up here too, and from left to right we've got two USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type A ports, 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, and the power button. On the back down the bottom, there's the 500-watt power supply. Above that, we've got the outputs from the graphics card, so these can vary by model. My RTX 2080 has a Type-C port, single HDMI, and 3 DisplayPort outputs. The motherboard has 4 USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type A ports up top, while the lower two are USB 2.0, along with the Ethernet port and 3.5mm audio output. I'll also note that I wasn't able to determine a difference in quality listening to music through either the front or rear 3.5mm jack. Underneath there are just some rubber feet. Both the left and right side panels can be removed by taking out 2 thumb screws. On the right, there's nothing really going on here, just some cable routing and 2 spare SATA power connectors. On the left panel we've got the window, and then inside access to everything else. The look of the interior wasn't too bad. No ketchup and mustard cables at least, so that puts it ahead of some other pre-built systems. The motherboard PCB was black, and there was customizable RGB lighting, more on that soon. On the bottom there's the 500-watt power supply, which isn't modular. Next to that are 2 3.5-inch drive bays, and both are pre-wired to the motherboard for both power and data, so you just need to screw either a 2.5 or 3.5-inch drive into the bay and stick it in, no need to mess around with cables. Towards the front, there's a 120mm fan pre-installed down the bottom for intake, with a spot above it to install a second. There's one spare fan header on the motherboard, however there was no dust filter present on the intake vents. Above that, we can also see our NVIDIA RTX 2080 graphics card, which has a blower style cooler in this case, so should help exhaust some of the air inside the case. Otherwise, the only other air exhaust is from the 120mm fan at the rear, which is on the all-in-one liquid cooler for the CPU. This looks a little small considering how hot the 9900K can get, but we'll test out thermals soon, but spoiler, it does fine. The spec sheet notes that it's a 130-watt TDP cooler, and we've got some pretty large VRM heatsinks too. The motherboard is Z370, so overclocking the CPU is supported, more on that soon. The motherboard has 2 memory slots, both of which are populated here. Next to that, there's the single M.2 slot for storage, which in my case contains a 512GB NVMe M.2 SSD, and it's covered in a heatsink to keep it cool from passive airflow. I checked underneath the graphics card, and we've got the M.2 slot for the Wi-Fi card. In terms of lighting, there are 3 RGB light strips, 2 on the front which are controlled together, and 1 above the window, and all are controlled through the Lenovo Vantage software. The color in the center of the CPU cooler, which is the Legion logo, is also controlled alongside the top light bar, and these can be controlled independently of the front lighting. The colored lights can be turned off, but the CPU cooler still has the white lights on the outside which could not be disabled. The Lenovo Vantage software also allows you to update the system or overclock the CPU and memory. No graphics card overclocking or fan control supported through here unfortunately. By simply ticking RAM overclocking, the memory speed will go from CL16 DDR4 2666 to CL16 DDR4 3200, though this will require a reboot to complete. The CPU overclocking option, on the other hand, will set all 8 CPU cores to 5.1 GHz and boost the power limit from the stock Intel 95 watts to 130 watts, the same TDP the cooler is rated for. And I found this stable under all tested workloads. However, as we'll see soon, I didn't get to this speed under stress test. Now let's look at the thermals. Testing was completed with an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees Celsius, so expect different results in different environments. I've stress tested the CPU with AIDA64 and the GPU with the Heaven benchmark, so treat these as kind of worst case results. At stock, the 9900K was hitting the 95 watt power limit defined by the Intel spec, and unfortunately, the blower style 2080 was actually reporting as thermal throttling. Fortunately, it was possible to boost the GPU fan speed through MSI Afterburner, which removed this and allowed it to perform better. Though, as we'll hear soon, this does make the system louder. When we enable the CPU and RAM overclocking through the Lenovo Vantage software, the CPU power limit raises to 130 watts and allows all 8 cores to run up to 5.1 GHz. At this point, we can improve performance further with some manual tweaks. We can boost the CPU power limit, which will give us more performance, but at the expense of more heat and fan noise. And I did this using Intel XTU. Alternatively, we can undervolt the CPU, so it will use less power and run cooler while also performing better. In this case, I've done both. I was also seeing the GPU temperature lower as the CPU started performing better, as the exhaust fan on the CPU cooler would ramp up, forcing more air to draw in from the front of the case. These are the average clock speeds from the same tests just shown. At stock, under this stress test load, the CPU is reaching 4 GHz on all 8 cores out of the box. We can see that by boosting the GPU fan speed manually, the GPU clock speed rises up as it's no longer thermal throttling. By enabling the Lenovo CPU overclock, we're getting about 400 MHz clock speed extra out of all 8 cores. And again, similar improvements to the GPU once we boost its fan speed. Raising the power limit of the CPU gave a little boost to CPU performance, while the CPU undervolt allowed us to almost hit 4.8 GHz on all cores, while the GPU overclock was almost reaching 2000 MHz. Here are some Cinebench CPU benchmarks, which show the difference in performance at stock and then with the extra performance gained with the overclock setting through the Lenovo Vantage software. By boosting the power limit and undervolting through Intel XTU, we were able to squeeze out some additional performance. As for the fan noise produced by the system, I'll let you have a listen to some of these tests. At idle, it was fairly quiet, and still not really that loud compared to other systems I've tested with the stress tests going. When we enable the CPU overclock through the Lenovo software, the total system volume rose a bit as the CPU fan spins up. After this point, we're doing custom tweaks to boost performance further, so only the first 3 tests represent out-of-the-box noise levels under worst-case stress test. I've also measured the total system power draw from the wall. At idle, we're looking at 47 watts, then 336 watts with the AIDA64 stress test and Heaven benchmark going. This rises by over 50 watts once we enable the built-in Lenovo overclocks, which boost all CPU cores to 5.1 GHz and PL1 from 95 watts to 130 watts. By further raising the power limit and overclocking the graphics, we're pulling much more power for not too much extra gain as we start hitting diminishing returns. Finally, let's get into some gaming benchmarks. I've tested these games with the memory and CPU overclocked, as the Lenovo Vantage software allows you to easily enable these built-in settings at the click of a button. No GPU overclocking though, as they don't offer that out of the box. And I wanted to represent what most people buying a system like this would be likely to run with. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode, and at 1080p with RTX off, it's running very well. Even with ultra settings, almost 120 FPS averages were possible, with up to 180 reached at low settings. Stepping up to the 1440p resolution saw lower results as expected. However, realistically, I think 90 FPS, even at ultra settings, is still a great result for this test. At 4K, we're only just below 60 FPS at high settings, and I still found it to play well without issues. And while it looks awesome, you'd of course want lower settings for higher frame rate if playing competitively. Far Cry New Dawn was tested with the built-in benchmark. At 1080p, as expected with these powerful specs, we're seeing excellent results in this test. At 1440p, there's a bit of a performance drop, but realistically the results are still looking good, with almost 100 FPS at ultra settings still possible. At 4K, things drop back a fair bit more, though it was still possible to hit 60 FPS at high settings. And we'll see how we can improve this game further with some custom overclocking soon. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was also tested with the built-in benchmark. At 1080p, we're seeing quite high results from this test. Still around 120 FPS, even with all settings maxed out at highest. At 1440p, the results drop back again, though not too far. It should still play quite well, even at higher settings with this resolution. At 4K, we're almost halving the frame rates from 1440p. And while we're still getting decent frame rates at lower settings, I'd probably just stick to 1440p and higher settings here. CSGO was tested with the Electrical FPS benchmark. This is a game that gives high frame rates on pretty much any hardware. So I just wanted to show an example of something that is less resource intensive. At 1080p, even with max settings, we're just under 400 FPS. At 1440p, max settings are still getting over 300 FPS, with minimum settings not too far below 500 FPS. Even 4K was still seeing great results. For contrast, these are still above most gaming laptops that I usually test at 1080p. We're seeing very nice performance here due to the i9-9900K and RTX 2080 graphics. All games were playing great, and even at higher settings and with 1440p. 4K still worked well at most setting levels in these titles. It just depends on the games you're playing and settings in use. As covered earlier, it was possible to further improve performance by undervolting and boosting the power limit of the CPU. I've also manually overclocked the graphics with MSI Afterburner. So let's see what sort of improvements we can get with this best case scenario. I've tested Far Cry New Dawn with the built-in benchmark, and we can see these changes are making some difference at 1080p, simply by enabling the predefined CPU and memory overclocks in the Lenovo Vantage software gives us 6% higher average FPS in this test, and then another 6% with my additional CPU undervolting and graphics overclocking. At 1440p, we're seeing a similar pattern of improvement, and again a 6% boost to average FPS with each level of change. At 4K, there's a smaller 4% improvement between stock and the Lenovo overclocks. As these are only CPU and memory, they have less of an effect in GPU demanding tests, such as at the 4K resolution. This is why we see a larger 11% improvement from the Lenovo overclocks with my custom changes. We're more GPU bound at 4K, so the graphics overclock helps more. I've used Crystal DiskMark to test the storage, and the 512GB M.2 NVMe SSD was scoring quite well for the read and write speeds. The 2TB hard drive was performing better than I expected, though they are using a 7200 RPM drive, which is nice, as many others seem to cheap out on the 5400 ones. For up-to-date pricing, check the links in the description, as prices will change over time. At the time of recording, in the US, they don't seem to have the exact specs I've got here. However, with the 9900K and double the RAM and double the SSD storage, we're looking at around $2,100 US. Meanwhile, here in Australia, we're looking at about 4,500 Australian dollars for these same specs I've tested in this video. Comparing against other pre-built systems from the larger brands, the price doesn't seem to be all that different here. And while you can always build your own system for cheaper, that's not who these sorts of machines are targeted towards. With that said though, for around the same price here in Australia, $100 more gets you basically the same specs but with 2080 Ti graphics, which is probably worthwhile considering the performance improvement that offers over the 2080. Overall, Lenovo's T730 gaming PC is a very capable machine. It's not large, but not small either, yet still offers great performance. Unfortunately, due to the blower style graphics card, it did get hot and thermal throttle under extended periods of load. However, it was possible to prevent this by raising the fan speed. Unfortunately, I didn't see a way of changing fan speed or controlling the graphics through the software provided by Lenovo, so I had to do that with third-party options, which a user buying a pre-built system may not be familiar with. Likewise, while it was possible to easily overclock the CPU and memory with one click using Lenovo's software, I'd like to see GPU overclocking added in future. As we saw, at higher resolutions, this can offer a large performance improvement. Though, as the GPU was thermal throttling, I'd also like to see fan controls provided as well. While on the subject of fans, some dust filters for the front air intakes would also be nice additions. Despite this, as we've seen, gaming performance was still excellent. With this particular configuration, even some 4K gaming was possible, depending on the games and settings of course, while 1440p and 1080p were absolutely no issue at all. Whether or not you like the design of the case will of course be personal preference, but at least it's got a handle. Now let's talk about upgrade options. I've left this to the end as I suspect many people buying a pre-built system like this just want it to work out of the box. But if you know a bit about what you're doing, this information may be useful if you're after some upgrades. In terms of graphics, it should be possible for you to replace the GPU as long as it fits in the given space in the case. There's room to use a 3-slot card if you remove the included support bracket. and the case has room for cards up to about 38cm in length. The power supply may be a limitation though, it only seems to include a 6 and 8 pin connector, so if you have two 8 pins, you might need an adapter. The 500 watt power supply might start to become a limitation depending on what you're upgrading to. As we saw, once I tried to get the best performance out of the 2080 and 9900K, the system was pulling 495 watts from the wall. The power supply appears to be standard ATX form factor though, and connects to the motherboard with an 8 pin and 24 pin connectors. The power supply was 14cm in length, and the distance to the drive bays is about 20cm, so you'd need to leave some room for the cables if replacing. The CPU is also upgradable. The Z370 chipset supports up to the i9-9900K at the moment, which is what we've already got installed here. If you have the lower 9700K, going to the 9900K should be an option, assuming it has the same cooler. The spec sheet seems to indicate that it does. If not, you may need to look at upgrading that too. At this stage, we don't know if Intel will keep using this socket and chipset for future CPUs beyond the 9900K. As mentioned already, the motherboard has two memory slots. In the US, it's sold with up to 32GB, so two 16GB sticks, though I'm not sure on two 32GB DIMM support. In terms of storage, there's just a single M.2 slot, so the only upgrade path there is to add one more SATA drive. The motherboard has three SATA ports, all of which are in use already, one for the DVD drive and two that are pre-wired to the drive bays. Technically, if you don't need the DVD drive though, you could wire up a third drive to that port. Many pre-built systems tend to not have many upgrade paths and make use of proprietary form factors. However, that was not the case here. It should be quite straightforward to upgrade most parts of this system like a regular PC, which is great to see. Though without replacing the motherboard, the 9900K may be the end of the line in terms of CPU power. Granted, that one should be quite good for many years yet. Let me know what you thought of the T730 down in the comments. And if you're new to the channel, consider getting subscribed for future tech videos like this one.